In 1912, 4,000 years of history came crashing down in just 4 months of revolution. You see, throughout all of Chinese history, they've been ruled by a dynasty and an empire, with the first one beginning in 2070 BC. But in 1912, the last Chinese dynasty abdicated the throne. For the first time in their history, their country was a republic. This set the stage for all of Chinese history that was to come, from the brutal Sino-Japanese War in the 30s and 40s, to the Chinese Communist Party, and eventually, the Tiananmen Square massacre. But before all of that could happen, something else had to happen. The president of the Republic of China declared himself the emperor of the Empire of China. He was going to attempt to restore monarchical rule and bring down Chinese democracy. However, bit by bit, his empire rapidly collapsed. Several provinces declared independence from China, and his armies suffered a series of reverses on the battlefield. On the 22nd of March, just 4 months after he declared the empire, he was forced to abdicate and dissolve the empire. Interestingly, he was able to keep his position as president of China, and some people did begin advocating for his resignation, and he probably would have had to resign if it wasn't for the fact that that summer, he died. The Empire of China, lasting 4 months, was one of the shortest lasting empires in human history. You may have heard that the Roman Empire was the longest lasting empire in history, being founded in 27 BC and collapsing in 1453 AD, for a grand total of 1,480 years. But what is the shortest lasting empire in human history? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that is quite dubious. Quite a lot of these supposed shortest lasting empires don't really count as empires in my opinion, but if your definition of an empire is just anything with the name empire in the title, well then yes, the Empire of China is probably the shortest lasting empire in history. But the problem is, Shikai was never really able to properly concentrate his power, and I really don't think it gets to call itself an empire. So in this video, we're going to go through several different candidates for who could be the shortest lasting empire in history, and find out who really wins the title of least enduring empire of all time. To start, let me show you what I meant when I said some of the shortest lasting empires really don't count as empires. After France fell to Germany in 1940, Japan came in and occupied Indochina. However, Japan wasn't going to bother going to the effort of setting up their own government structure. No, that would take effort. So, they saved themselves the time by allowing the Vichy French administration to remain in place. The French governor of Indochina and all his French subordinates were allowed to continue governing the territory, which was still occupied by French police and military. However, it was also occupied by Japanese military, and everybody knew that the Japanese were really in charge. French Indochina was a puppet state of Japan. However, on the 9th of March 1945, Japan sent an ultimatum to the French governor of Indochina. Within 2 hours, all French police and military in the territory must be dissolved, and power handed over to Japan. The governor sent a reply asking for further negotiations, and Japan responded by immediately attacking all French troops in the territory. Within 48 hours, almost all French troops in the region had been captured, and a few lucky ones had escaped into China. On the 11th of March 1945, Japan declared the Empire of Vietnam, and promptly filled its government positions with the Japanese people, because this Empire of Vietnam was a Japanese puppet state. The Empire of Vietnam maintained its existence for 5.5 months, before it was dissolved shortly before the surrender of Japan. We can't call the Empire of Vietnam an empire when it was in fact the subject of an empire. So, instead of China and Vietnam, let's look at a few other candidates. Something else you might bring up is the Empire of Haiti. This lasted 2 years, from 1804 to 1806. However, this was literally just the modern borders of Haiti with the word empire scribbled on it. The First Empire of Mexico lasted 2 years, and the Second Empire of Mexico lasted 3. Here's another empire that lasted 3 years. In 1976, the president of the Central African Republic declared himself emperor of the brand new Central African Empire. He spent an amount of money on his coronation which is similar to a quarter of the country's annual budget. Luckily though, he had France pay for most of it. One day when the self-appointed emperor was sitting in his home, he had a slight moment of reflection. He thought, isn't it a bit unfair that my soldiers are beating up student protesters on the streets while I'm living a life of luxury in my palace? Yeah, that is unfair. You know what? Starting today, I'm gonna make a change. And I'm starting with the man in the mirror. Instead of sending my soldiers to beat people up, I'm gonna join in myself. Oh, sorry, did you think he was getting a redemption arc? Basically, after Bokassa was overthrown, 2 students went to the New York Times to talk about how they had been arrested for protesting against Bokassa. One of them had been crammed into a cell of 15 people. Another had been crammed into a cell of what he estimated to be 40. They were packed so tightly that the guy in the cell of 40 people said there were several dead bodies on the ground by the time the Emperor walked in. When he did, the Emperor started beating children with a stick. Several people died this way. The guards also beat people up as well, and according to one of the students, he was one of 3 survivors out of 40 in his cell. He survived by playing dead. And by the way, all the people in these cells were aged between 6 and 20. The one question I do have for him, how did the Emperor fit in the cell if it was so tightly packed that several of the students suffocated to death? Like, I still believe the story, but I decided to include that one contradiction in there, just in case that makes any of you not want to believe it. Anyway, in 1979, 3 years after his empire was created, he went on a trip to Libya, and while he was gone, France went in and got rid of his empire. They then restored the Central African Republic. The main reason that I brought up Bokassa's empire is to contrast it with the Empire of Haiti. You see, an empire is when one state or person rules over multiple countries. So in other words, if an empire is not multi-ethnic, then it isn't an empire. Of course, the Central African Republic has a lot of ethnicities in it, making it definitely an empire. From what I can tell, Haiti appears to have a lot less minority ethnic groups than the Central African Republic, so you could argue that maybe the Haitian Empire wasn't an empire, but the Central African Empire was. However, it is worth noting that under that definition of empire, you could say that Spain and Britain are still empires to this day. And I'm not saying they're not, by the way. Like, I do believe that the United Kingdom is functionally the English Empire for all intents and purposes. In fact, come to think of it, it seems like when you really boil it down, an empire is just a country with more than one major nationality or ethnic group in it. But if we go with that definition, then this video just turns into what's the shortest lived multi-ethnic state? And if I went through every single short-lived multi-ethnic state, we would be here forever. I promise you, I can think of a lot of multi-ethnic states that didn't last a very long time. If you want to learn about them, I have a whole series about the aftermath of World War I. Boy, were there a lot. So I decided, just to protect the runtime of this video and make sure we weren't here too long, to limit myself to countries that had empire in the name. For example, the Palmyra Empire. I believe that if the campaign that I am about to talk about had a different outcome, then the Roman Empire would have been brought down well over 1,000 years before it was in our current timeline. You see, one day, in the 3rd century AD, Queen Zenobia, queen of the Syrian city of Palmyra, decided that she didn't want to be a Roman subject anymore. Instead, she was going to conquer herself an empire. So, in late 269 AD, she launched a bunch of invasions. She conquered Syria, she conquered Palestine, she conquered the entire Levant. This was crucial, as the Gallic Empire currently controlled France and Spain, so the loss of Syria meant that Rome had been split in 2 across the Mediterranean. But Zenobia's thirst for conquest wasn't done yet. She invaded Egypt and conquered the vital breadbasket of the Nile River. Then, she launched another successful campaign in the north, conquering a lot of modern-day Turkey. Archaeologists have actually found coins from that era with her face on it. The fact that she was able to print her face on the currency like that meant that she definitely had a lot of control. This was undeniably an amazing achievement. But unfortunately for Zenobia, her empire would go on to earn a place in a video about the shortest-lived empires in human history, because the Roman counterattack very quickly began. In 272 AD, Palmyra was sacked, all of its walls were destroyed, and it was robbed of all its wealth, allowed to fade into insignificance. Queen Zenobia was paraded through Rome in golden chains. The empire only lasted 3 years, so it didn't have that much of an influence on history. However, it's still an undeniably very impressive achievement to be the woman who, even for just a moment, crippled the greatest empire in human history up to that point. The final candidate is the German Empire. No, not that one, the one you haven't heard of. Kind of a running theme for this video. It was founded in 1848, collapsed in 1849. It lasted about 19 months, give or take. You see, in 1848, France sneezed, and Europe caught a cold. To elaborate, every major nation in Europe, except for Russia and Britain, suffered a revolution in 1848. It started in Italy, before the revolutions spread to France, then Austria, and finally Germany. Monarchies all over Germany were forced to bow down and grant a constitution to the people of their country. In Frankfurt, German nationalists gathered together to form the Frankfurt National Assembly. They intended that this National Assembly was going to rule all of Germany. The Assembly declared the creation of the German Empire, which claimed all the territory currently contained within the Confederation of the Rhine. There were 39 countries in the German Confederation at the time, and the German Empire went round to all of them and said, "Hey, who wants to join my new empire?" And turns out, the answer was quite a lot. When they published their constitution, 28 countries signed it. This sounds like an impressive number, until you realise that most of these countries were like the size of a goddamn pickle. In light green is all the territory they claimed. In dark green is the territory that they actually controlled. I'm using controlled very lightly here, because quite often some of the larger states in the German Empire didn't really bother doing what the Frankfurt National Parliament wanted. Even the smaller states generally ran themselves. Still, in 1848, the first ever German election in history happened, when hundreds of members were elected all over the German states to the Frankfurt National Parliament. However, if they couldn't get Austria or Prussia on side, it wasn't going to last. They elected an Austrian Archduke to be their provisional head of state, but Austria as a whole did not support them. They elected the King of Prussia to be their constitutional monarch, however the king turned down the crown. And so, in 1849, all the larger states in the German Confederation forced the empire to dissolve itself. The German Empire lasted longer than the empires of China and Vietnam, but shorter than all the other empires we've talked about today. So, if we agree that the German Empire actually counts as an empire, then yes, it would be the shortest lasting empire in human history. So was it the shortest lasting empire in human history? Not in my opinion, no. I've already mentioned that the German states within it maintained a high degree of independence. It wasn't really an empire, more a confederation. In conclusion, our candidates for the shortest empire in human history that we've gone over in this video were the empires of China, Vietnam, Haiti, Mexico, Central Africa, Palmyra, and Germany. In my opinion, the empires of China, Vietnam, and Germany do not count as empires. The empires of Central Africa and Palmyra both lasted about 3 years, but due to the fact that Palmyra happened over 1,000 years ago, we don't know the exact date, so we don't know which one of these two empires lasted for a longer time. So that just leaves the first Mexican Empire and the first Empire of Haiti. The first Haitian Empire lasted 755 days, and the first Mexican Empire lasted 537 days, making the first Mexican Empire, in my opinion, the shortest lasting empire in human history.